All right, this is part of a larger presentation, Stop the Guessing Game, implementing a criterion and evidence-based functional performance testing algorithm in foot and ankle injuries. This section will focus on the muscle performance aspects of testing someone's readiness to return to activity in sport. All right, assessing the muscle performance of the foot and ankle, as we will see, is critical in any athletic and physical recreational endeavor. It really is the powerhouse with forward and vertical propulsion. It works eccentrically upon landing, jumping, and cutting. And we'll see as we go through this some of the key aspects, not only of motor coordination, endurance, strength, and power as we move forward through the different assessments. Okay, so muscle performance is a rather broad term, so let's start with some operational definitions. So this includes motor coordination, which is the ability to move multiple body parts in a coordinated, effective, and efficient manner. This is utilized predominantly qualitative in the clinical setting, but can also be quantitative with the right equipment. The second is muscle endurance, which is the ability to maintain a specific percentage of maximal volitional contraction over a period of time. We usually quantify this in work or total work or number of reps. You can also quantify someone's fatigue index over time. We have muscle strength, which I think the vast majority of us are quite familiar with, which is the maximal amount of force that a muscle or muscles can generate. It incorporates mass times acceleration, which equals force, often measured in newtons or pounds. Muscle power is muscle strength, but with an element of time. It's the maximal force a muscle or muscle group can generate over a given unit of time. And we quantify power with force times velocity, quantified in watts or joules per second, or Newton meters per second, or if you're using English units, it's going to be the foot pounds per second. And then we have muscle reactive strength, which is the ability to quickly transition from an eccentric to a concentric contraction, and this is quantified usually with reactive strength indices when you're looking at meters per second, oftentimes with jump height and contact forces and contact times. So not all assessments are created equal. So your gold standard is going to be your isokinetic dynamometry, followed by your good category, which is fixated dynamometer, or which also includes a time force curve, which is critical. Your force plate, particularly for your plantar flexion, and maybe if you get creative with hallux flexion, but it's really not appropriate for your inversion or eversion or your dorsiflexion. I suppose you could potentially finagle that setup, but it hasn't really been described or validated to my knowledge. And then the acceptable category, which is your fixated dynamometry without time force curve. This includes your pull gauge and or crane scale. Then we have our sufficient category, which gets the job done, but it is not optimal nor necessarily ideal, but certainly gives you a gauge as to someone's strength or muscle performance or endurance, depending on which construct we're looking at. This includes your 1 RM testing, your multiple RM testing. It also includes manually fixated dynamometers. And then your sufficient category or questionable category, in my opinion, would be your manual muscle testing, which has its potential role in screening grossly someone's force application, but it is really not sufficient to be able to determine someone's readiness to return to sport or activity, in my opinion. All right, well, so let's start in with the foot intrinsics, and we'll look at the motor coordination, muscle endurance, and strength for the foot. So it is true that the ankle muscles, especially the plantar flexors, are key contributors to sport performance, and they play a critical role in the acceleration of the body rapidly moving forward or in different directions, including sprinting, cutting, and jumping. These assumptions are based on the oversimplification, however, of a rigid foot model, i.e. there'd be no deformation of the foot. And these models thus lead to overestimation of ankle power contributions while simultaneously underestimating the power generated by the structures within the foot. And so whatever the hip and the knee and the ankle power generation capacity and capabilities are, if the foot system deforms under tension, it is not able to transfer that power into the ground. the technique of the athlete and the mechanical effectiveness, and ultimately the acceleration and the performance degrade. Thus, the important contributions for lower limb power transfer and push-off come not only from the ankle plantar flexion and flexors, but also from the foot structures to resist this deformation. And not only do they resist the deformation, they can actually be energy storing and energy returning if it has its proper training and proper capacities and capabilities. The power of the ankle plantar flexors is equally as important as the capacity of the foot structures to resist the deformation for the efficiency in order to efficiently promote power transfer during the push-off, particularly during horizontal, but also during vertical maneuvers as well. All right, so let's start off with motor coordination. So I use a modified spring ankle test, which is a navicular drop test. It's formulated from and described by Cal Dietz in Triphasic. So there's three components. So you have this single leg sit to stand where the client goes from a non-weight bearing to a weight bearing position. You're looking for less than 5 millimeters of drop from the non-weight bearing to the weight bearing. Then you have a single leg squat where you ask the client to go into a single leg squat position where the knee translates 2 inches past the second and third metatarsal. And once again, you're looking for less than 3 to 5 millimeters drop with the ability to achieve that 2 inches over toe. So there needs to be sufficient dorsiflexion and sufficient tension within the arch such that they don't go into more of a pronated position. And then the single leg calf raise, where the client performs a single leg calf raise with maximal heel height and is able to achieve a greater than 45 degree angle of the foot relative to the floor. And you can see the involved versus the uninvolved limb here. I don't think I need to clarify which one's which. And then in the third video, you can see that there's the utilization of a translucent goniometer where the clinician can, in live time, monitor the navicular drop. Also, a classic index card can also be utilized in order to measure the discrepancies during the different phases. And this motor coordination test would be considered to be sufficient. It is more of a field-based qualitative assessment. That being said, I found good utility in not only determining someone's capabilities here, but also recognizing when additional work would be otherwise necessary. And you can certainly see discrepancies between one limb and the next. Okay, let's turn to muscle endurance. So for the foot intrinsic, I utilize, again, pulling from Triphasic and Cal Dietz recommendation. I really like these field tests. I found that good clinical utility, easy applicability, and then the assessment then becomes the intervention. So there's 4 conditions. So the first 2 conditions, you have knee straight. Condition 1 is in a plantar flex position. The second is in a max dorsiflex position. Condition 3 and 4 have knee flex positions. You're flexing the knee to 75 to 90 degrees, and then you're going into either max plantar flexion and or max dorsiflexion, depending on the condition. Your criteria here is that they should be able to hold each position against body weight for 60 seconds and without letting the heel height drop by more than 20%. The limb symmetry indices based off time should be within 10%, and that is in again, your outcome is in seconds. For higher level athletes, it is due to the additional demands that are needed for the foot, and in order to have that important energy storing capacity in return and counteract the deformation of the ground reaction forces as well as the intrinsic forces that are generated by the ankle, hip, and knee. It is recommended these athletes are able to perform the 60-second holds with body weight for greater than 20% of their body weight. Again, they can hold this weight, or they could also utilize a weight vest. Okay, and again, this is a field-based test. Recognize that its limitations, but the ease of applicability, its translation directly into interventions, the quantification of foot strength across time and the monitoring of that has really made it a really nice, good utility for testing people's foot intrinsic endurance. And here's just a closer caption, right? So you have the equipment, the different conditions, the modifications as shown in the left-hand portion of the screen, and then the different images. So you do have the option. I use a small, again, it's just a foam dowel with a Crayola marker stuck in between, or you can use a Sharpie as well, where the individual also has to flex around the dowel such that you engage the foot. The EMG of the foot is significantly higher with that, is what I have found. Particularly people often feel it in the arch and in the foot specifically. And you can see the sagittal as well as the frontal plane positions. Okay, so let's turn our attention to foot strength. So with the foot strength, you can see the image demonstrating there that you can either do externally or manually supported or fixated handheld dynamometer. Again, the microfit handheld dynamometer does not have a time force curve associated with it. It predominantly is just force outcome. And so that it has its own limitations. You can't see the force trend over time, but it does give you the values that you need. When you look at the reliability, so a lot of numbers, you can focus in on a couple of things specifically. So you can see your standard error of measurement in newtons there, and it's a relatively small percentage relative to the actual values that you see, which is good. You want low standard error of measure. The minimal detectable change would be 51 newtons. And then you can see the color scheme for the inter-rater reliability as well as the retest reliability. The spectrum there shows cool colors, that is blue, being poor reliability, warm, hot colors, that is orange and red, being good to excellent reliability. And you can see that across the board it's orange and or red, which suggests that this is a reliable means by which you can assess your hallux and your lesser toes. What are you looking for? You're looking for a certain strength relative to body weight. Specifically, in your normative data, you want greater than 20% body weight. In an athletic population, they have shown to be slightly superior to that at 27% body weight. For your lesser toes, obviously less, so 18% to 22%, and you put the other 4 toes on it as the individual flexes. Usually, depending on the person's foot size, usually you can get all 4 toes, at least using the microfit, as far as like the size of the surface being tested. Your ratios here, you're looking for 1.2 to 1.3. That is the hallux flexion versus the lesser toes. Again, this is considered to be acceptable because it can be externally fixated, and you can also utilize a handheld dynamometer that has a time force curve rather than just the microfit as shown. Okay, so let's talk about the summary of some of the muscle performance tests for the foot. So we're looking for motor coordination, so a dynamic navicular drop single leg squat assessment. Your navicular drop height typically ranges between 6 and 8. Cal Dietz with the dynamic navicular spring ankle test would suggest less than 3 to 5 millimeters for good foot intrinsic and arch support. From non-weight bearing to weight bearing, the ability to achieve 2 inches over the toe and that 45-degree angle. The muscular endurance, right? So you're going to be looking at greater than 60-second holds for the different spring ankle conditions, knee straight, knee flexed, as well as plantar flexed and dorsiflexed. And then finally, the muscular strength. You're looking at your 20 to 27% body weight with hallux flexion and 18 to 22% for your lesser toes. And then for your limb comparison, you're looking for greater than 90%. And then eventually you want individuals to be able to hit their demographic norms, that is age, gender, condition, and their activity or sport specific demographic. Right, moving up the chain. So ankle, sagittal plane, plantar flexion, and dorsiflexion. Once again, we'll look at endurance, we'll look at strength, and we'll also look at power. Okay, so why do we care about ankle plantar flexion? I gave the argument earlier and the information about its importance in ankle power production, particularly vertical, horizontal, as well as in cutting sports. But after injury, it's really imperative that we restore this. So here's an example of a timeline. So 1 to 2 years after Achilles tendon rupture, individuals still show to have a decrease in muscle volume of 1.6 centimeters cubed, and then you also have 17.7 versus like your 24 to 8%, 24.8% soleus volume is still decreased. So if you're not familiar with what percentage 1.6 centimeters cubed is, at least gives you a percentage there. You have architectural changes with 59% shorter fascicle lengths. Still at 3 to 5 years, you're looking at 47% decrease in plantar flexion isometric strength at times, greater than 20% isokinetic, concentrically and eccentric strength. You have an increase in Achilles tendon resting angle, which we spoke of. So you have less stiffness and less force capacity within the tendon itself. You have 12 to 20% shorter fascicle lengths, still at 3 to 5 years. And then post-Achilles tendon rupture, there's also up to an increase in contralateral Achilles tendon pathology by 176% within 3.1 years following the initial insult. Heel height is 25% less on the opposite side following your Achilles tendon rupture, again, regardless of operative or non-operative. And then, it just persists. So even a decade afterwards, we can have continued decreased muscle volumes, meaningful differences in muscle strength, decrease in our power and our velocity with our jump height, as well as our angular velocity of the ankle with jumps. And so it's really in our wheelhouse to be able to address these deficits. And you can't, you can guess and continue to just train blindly, but statistics would suggest that there are ongoing deficits, and in order to ensure that we have really recouped the full capacity of the triceps surae after such injuries and insults, that it would be wise of us to measure and to monitor and determine someone's to ensure that someone makes that full recuperation before they return to sport or activity. And then even 13 years out, there's still shown to be deficits depending on the population that you're looking at. Okay, so if we're looking at the gold standard, it's going to be the isokinetic dynamometry for your plantar flexors. All right, so there are multiple positions that have been described when testing the foot and ankle and an isokinetic dynamometer. The Biodex manual has described a seated position with knee and hip flex as shown. They've also described a supine position. My recommendations are that there's limitations with both of these. I found to have better consistency, reliability, and even patient comfort and better outcomes with some other positions that I'll show you. All right, so this is my ideal position that I use on a regular basis. I'll conventionally call it option 2B. So you have the firm stop there preventing the hip extension and contribution. You have multiple belts that prevent any extraneous motion. Though the gentleman is showing his hands folded, he would hold on to the frame underneath during the actual testing to prevent any extraneous movement from coming and ensure that he's nice and stable. And then having the tibia parallel to the floor with the knee flexed to approximately 90 degrees would be the ideal in order to mitigate the contributions from the other major muscle groups. And as I mentioned, the isokinetic dynamometer really, in my opinion, is the gold standard. You can measure multiple constructs and muscle performance in a very valid and a relatively efficient way all at once. So you look at motor coordination, muscle endurance, muscle strength, as well as muscle power here. Yes, then you have ankle plantar flexion testing. So the prone position, if I'm going to be doing it in the knee straight position, which I do almost unanimously the majority of the time, unless I'm really interested in biasing someone's soleus. So the patient's going to be supine, the knee's going to be extended, and the hip is going to be extended at 0 degrees. You have the stabilization waist belt, as well as at the distal femur just over their patella. And then you have the stabilization of the contralateral leg and the handhold. You can see the knee flat, the non-testing limb is going to be flexed with the foot firmly planted, which further helps for stabilization. And so this is the ideal position. I've just found really good consistency, reliability. I find that the patient has also given their own testimony. I've questioned them on with all the different setups, and this seems to be the winner and the way that I consistently do it. And this study, though dated, was really influential for me. It really helped me to conceptualize what the contribution of plantar flexion force is across the spectrum of the ankle angles. So on the y-axis, you have peak torque in Newton meters, and then you have the ankle angles starting with -30 by convention. This is going to be plantar flexion, and you can see the dorsiflexion shown at 20 degrees. And the plantar flexors are dorsiflexion biased, meaning the greater dorsiflexion that you're in, the greater plantar flexion force you're able to create. And you can see the soleus as highlighted in blue. The black line shows the total amount of aggregate force. This is the gastroc. So the gastroc has a little bit more contribution where your ankle is more in a plantar flex position, but thereafter the soleus really takes over in that greater dorsiflex position. And then the other plantar flexors, such as your toe flexors, etc., really have a relatively flat line contribution across all ankle angles, and maybe a slight tapering in the dorsiflex position. So the debate goes on as to whether you test with your knee straight or knee extended. So do the knee angles actually affect plantar flexion strength testing outcomes? When you look at a consensus of multiple papers, so the knee angles do not affect plantar flexion strength testing outcomes, but the extent and nature of this force outcome is varied based upon the specific parameters. So in the first column, you have the different variables, and then the influence of what the knee angle would have on the force outcomes and parameters. So you have peak torque and power. Knee flexion angles at 15, 45, and 90. Increased knee flexion angle decreases the power and torque. Fatigue indices, right? So the knee flexion angle has no significant effect on fatigue, on force steadiness, nor on the post Achilles repair. It doesn't really affect the isometric plantar flexion moments. The position of the angle is a more critical determinant of the plantar flexion strength, and so that can help guide your determination as to what position you may otherwise want to test in. Again, it has been shown that there's a slight bias towards the soleus with more knee flex position, as well as with a greater dorsiflex position of the ankle. Okay, so the first thing you're going to want to look at is the normality of the strength curve. And I consider this to be motor coordination or muscle coordination as assessed by the isokinetic. And so it's important to be familiar with what is normal for your force time curves for whatever muscle you're testing, but in this case, obviously our topic today being the foot and the ankle. And so your plantar flexion force time curve, in this case, force positional curve, you can see the ankle angles on the x-axis and then the torque in foot-pounds on the y, is that this would be a normal, both of these would be normal force curve profiles. It kind of looks like a slide that you would see at a playground. So at the pinnacle in the most dorsiflex position, that is, you're getting your peak torque around, depends on the individual, but in this case, both peaks for the involved, that is the blue, and then the involved would be the pink, the healthy limb, the uninvolved would be the blue. And you can see that the peak torque is achieved around 30 degrees of dorsiflexion. And so if I use parameters in my range of motion of assessment shorter than that, say between 25 and 25 for dorsiflexion, plantar flexion respectively, then I would actually miss this peak force point. So that is a critical aspect of what we're looking at. And then again, it's not just important to look at the peak torque, the normality of the strength curve, but then also throughout the range, right? And so one of the things that you can commonly see, as shown here, occurs with your Achilles rupture, be it repair or non-operatively, where they lose the end range plantar flexion strength. Which is going to be critical for your push off, your pre-swing, your jumping, a lot of the athletic endeavors and recreational endeavors, and even non-athletic means of just walking. That this can be an important element for the disability that lingers and the deficits that linger following Achilles tendon repair and rupture, as they lose this elastic recoil of the tendon. And then the active torque is shown on the y-axis. You have your percentage of max, and the point of this image, the first image that I showed was an actual patient that I had strength test, but this would be further validation that regardless of what percentage of max that they're working at, is that your peak torque angle is around the same. It's going to be around that 20 to 30 degrees of dorsiflexion, and so it's important to test really through that range of motion as best as you possibly can. Okay, so what we're looking at here is what I consider to be muscle coordination. It's the normality of the strength curve that you're first looking at when you're considering interpretation of an isokinetic test. So on the y-axis you have torque in foot-pounds. Running across the x-axis you have the ankle angles, right? So it's a force positional curve, and the concentric results often show a peak and then a rapid drop followed by recovery. This is because the tendon is placed under different stresses compared to the leverage through the ankle range. In the mid-range, the plantar grade is most commonly affected, as this often demonstrates the highest lever of disadvantage for the Achilles, the contractile unit. But the normal strength curve really is this oblong. I kind of imagine it as a slide on a playground where you have the greatest peak force being achieved at the end ranges of dorsiflexion, and then a gradual decline as the individual approaches more of a plantar flex position. And the key here is that you can see the differences once again at the peak torque angle of close to 25, 30 degrees, and then the loss of strength in the involved leg, that is the pink limb, as they approach closer and closer to the more plantar flex position. This position being critical for push off, not only during gait, but running, jumping, as well as cutting-based maneuvers. So what would be an abnormal strength curve? It would look something like this. And this is what I was alluding to with the mid-range. That is, the plantar grade is most commonly affected in this portion. And this would be an example of an Achilles tendinopathy where there's a loss of strength or an inversion, a convexity that is shown there. And the wonderful thing about the isokinetic is that you can also look at the normality of the strength curve under eccentric conditions as well. So you're just looking at an inversion of the force curve here. Again, it's inverted because you're looking at eccentric. So you have torque on the y-axis. Again, the same angles as shown as in the previous slide, but now you can see that the dorsiflexion is to the right of the graph. Again, that yellow bar indicating once again the ankle neutral position, and you're being tested at 30 degrees per second. And in slow eccentric tests, there's often a concavity in the midsection to the results. This is most likely due to the neural inhibition of the muscle to protect the affected structure. In fast eccentrics, the results often peak, but then it just demonstrates pain inhibition with very irregular mid and late curves. So this is essentially more of a little bit of a blip in of the inversion and the fluctuation of the force curve. You can see it more predominantly around that pink, the pink, which is the involved limb. But what it can look like, here's a kind of more of an illustration of it, with the slower being on top and then the faster inhibition shown on the bottom graph there. This shows a similar relationship with the dorsiflexion. Again, you have torque on the y-axis, and then you have the ankle plantar flexion angle running along the x. And you can see that this is specifically for concentric dorsiflexion, where in a stretched elongated position that is in a plantar flex position, the dorsiflexors are able to achieve their peak torque around 35 degrees or so. And then with that being tapered as they get more active insufficiency, closer and closer to a neutral foot position. And then for your eccentric dorsiflexion strength, once again, you can see that regardless of whether we're talking concentric or eccentric strengthening assessment, that the peak torque angle is relatively the same. And this is simply just showing a pre-test and a post-test, pre and post intervention. Okay, so see key summary slide for your isokinetic criteria. So you're looking for your motor coordination, that is quality of the force positional curve. For your muscle endurance, I've provided normative values that you can look at in your own time. It's part of the handout with the normal total work at the different degrees. There's also fatigue recommendations that are based off that assessment, where you're doing 30 repetitions for 180 degrees per second and 10 repetitions for the 90 degrees per second. For muscle strength, once again, it's going to be dependent upon males versus females, whether you're looking at plantar flexion, concentric strength, or eccentric strength, and same thing for the dorsiflexors. And then you're also looking at muscle power. So your average muscle power is in watts for both the plantar flexion and dorsiflexion at 180 degrees per second. But really, at the end of the day, what you're going to be considering is the quality and similarity of the strength curvature and the force positional curves, as well as the limb symmetry indices, and then trying to get the individual to be 90% or within at least one standard deviation of what is expected for their condition and or the surgery that they've undergone. Moving beyond the isokinetic, what are the other assessment tools and tests that can be performed in order to look at the muscle performance for the triceps surae? Probably the most common performed assessment for looking at the muscle performance of the foot and the ankle is a single leg calf raise. Just because it's common in clinical practice, I don't think that it's common practice to perform it in a structured or standardized fashion. I think that there's value in doing so because it enhances our reliability as well as the validity and the repeatability of the assessment. So if I could give some insights and detail as to how this may be executed. So you can see the patient position, single leg stance, locked out at 0 degrees at the knee as well as at the hip. The ankle can either be off the ground as shown, or it can be on a 10 degree slant board into dorsiflexion. The forearm length away from the wall is the distance that is standardized. So the individual adducts their arms, puts their fist out, and then puts their fist flush against the wall, and that would be their standardized distance from one time point to the next. The equipment that you're going to need is a tape measure for the heel height. A calf raise app is optional, which could give you the power, the heel height, the loss of heel height, as well as the number of repetitions. And then the metronome app for standardizing the tempo at which they perform it, and then a wall or stable object for them to support themselves on. You can see the starting position again at 0 degrees in this instance, but it can be in that dorsiflex position, which we spoke about previously, that the plantar flexors are dorsiflexion biased, thus it may be actually advantageous to do it through a negative range of motion. I provided the heel height statistics there for you in regards to the reliability, the standard error of measure, and what you can deem to be the minimal detectable change as a percent of the heel height. It's important to recognize that the performance of this assessment does not correlate nearly at all with someone's plantar flexion peak torque. And so it is really a different construct that is being assessed here. It is really muscular endurance and work capacity of the foot and the ankle and the calf muscles. And not to neglect its value. Again, I think it's important, especially with the amount of volume that people do with their foot and the ankle, be it running, jogging, athletic endeavors, non-athletic endeavors, just life in general, that it's important to have high work capacity, but just recognize what we're actually measuring when we actually take the number of repetitions or number of repetitions to fatigue. The tempo, as I mentioned, is going to be standardized at 60 beats per minute. That's a tick at the top and a tick at the bottom. I will have a consistent distance away from the wall, and then you can see that I use a ruler there to monitor their heel height. Usually the assessment drops when their heel height, they can no longer achieve the same heel height by of 80% of which they started. This would be considered to be a sufficient field test. Again, it's measuring muscular endurance rather than muscular strength. And I circle the knee only for the instance that common compensation is that they're going to flex at the knee, and they also will lean into the wall rather than going vertically straight up, which is also a means by which they can gain mechanical advantage to improve the performance with the heel height elevation. Okay, so as I alluded to with the single leg raise test, you can utilize the calf raise app. It will monitor peak height, that is heel height, total heel height over the duration of the set, the percent of heel height loss over said number of repetitions, which will give you a fatigue index that you can monitor between limbs as well as across time. It will give you total work as well as total power that is produced during the set. The concurrent validity here is good to excellent for total work. Number of repetitions, 100% consistent with a linear encoder. It is important to note that using a heel as the surrogate center of mass for the body overestimates the total work by 21 to 25% compared to the gold standard of a 3D motion capture system, but it is able to precisely detect the relative difference between the limbs, and thus it's a reliable measure even if it underestimates the total power. And we also know that using the heel rise work test is valid when using it relative to the difference in the other limb. And it would also be, it's important to note that the total work is a more granular and more a valid metric to determine disability after Achilles rupture and or repair than is heel height or number of repetitions alone. All right, sticking with our quality assessment of the single leg calf raise test, I will say that there's been published research that would suggest that and shows that if the quality assurance is not implemented with this assessment, that the number of repetitions and the overall outcome measures are significantly different. So you want to maintain the original footprint throughout the entirety of the assessment, especially if you're doing it on a slant board. Sometimes people will tend to drift backwards. For your foot and ankle mechanics, you want to have plantar flexion of both the ankle and plantar flexion of the foot itself. I'll give an example moving forward. And then the test stops when the metronome pace cannot be maintained. Heel height drops by 20% 20%. Knee flexion occurs with proper cueing and they're unable to correct or unwilling. And then hip propulsion strategy was used where they essentially use momentum based, lean forward, and or ensure, and you need to ensure that the majority of the force goes through the first and the second metatarsal head, rather than what you can see there is more of a sickling effect of the foot, as it's known, where you go into an inversion moment. Even though that is a natural means, when you get to your end range plantar flexion, you want to try and ensure that that you're testing what you think you're testing, which typically it's going to be the gastroc and soleus complex with a bias to the gastroc given the straight knee. Yet you're not really looking for the compensation of the posterior or the tibialis posterior or peroneal muscles. And then the ankle maintains alignment with the second toe pointed due north or perpendicular to the wall. So again, as I mentioned, though the inversion of the rear foot is normal during single leg heel raise, excessive inversion would be an unbalance between the peroneal muscles and the tibialis posterior, and give me more of a compensation for weaker plantar flexors, and thus should be controlled. And again, without controlling these parameters and having a standard operating procedure, the outcome and thus the validity and the reliability of your assessment becomes more in question. So in the previous slide, I mentioned one of the criteria is having plantar flexion at the foot as well as at the ankle. And so I just want to give some examples of what that looks like, which would be in this upper left-hand corner. And if you see this, have them continue to train on. If you see this, it's an ankle problem. They're getting more plantar flexion at the midfoot, rather than at the ankle joint. And you can see the small schematic there denoting the difference. And you can kind of compare and contrast that, particularly with the angle that is achieved by the lower shank as well as the calcaneus. The other issue is a foot problem, right, where someone plantar flexes at the ankle but then collapses through the mid-arch and they go into more of a dorsiflexion at their midfoot. And then this is a problem on both accounts, where you have limited heel height and limited plantar flexion at the midfoot. And you can kind of see I've kind of plugged in the small lines there as an indication of red and green as those angles that are being adequate and those angles that are being inadequate as demonstrated in red. And so when you're looking at the plantar flexion calf raise assessment, yes, get your quantitative metrics of work, heel height, total number of repetitions, even the power if you're using the application I suggested. But then you're also performing these quality assessments that are giving you even more information beyond just the numbers themselves. All right, and then, yeah, you can't go wrong with the old-fashioned field-based testing, 1RM testing, and you can do it both with knee extended as well as knees flexed. What I have found is that for the knee flex position, that the seated calf raise machine is the gold standard. It's really hard to otherwise replicate it. Otherwise, though, people certainly have found creative means by doing so. I find that I consistently kind of underload people, and they can do an excessive number of repetitions. I can't load them adequately enough, especially when we know that the soleus can, isometrically can produce 2 times body weight or more, depending on the caliber of your athlete and their strength. And then for the leg press assessment, you can see there that I have it's a little bit hard to see, but that red line indicates that I'm holding a stick to ensure that they are able to achieve the same heel height on each subsequent repetition and having them lock it out. I do it 60 beats per minute, similar to what I had mentioned previously with the standing version. And then I also will start people at 50% of their body weight, seeing how many repetitions they can do, especially for our goals are not pure strength, but we're still on the endurance endeavor. Obviously, you can increase the percentage of what they're lifting relative to their body weight if your goals are to actually measure strength, and depending on what your target 1 rep max is. Same stopping criteria as I mentioned with the single leg calf raise. Okay, so then what do you do with the results? So I found really good application and utility with this app, right? So you have the 1RM, I believe it's called, and I will just put in the number of repetitions that they achieved as well as the weight lifted, and it will quantify predict their 1 rep max, and then it also can be utilized for prescriptive means as far as if I'm going to send them home with X amount of repetitions, sets, etc., sticking by our strength and conditioning principles and trying to ensure that they're lifting a certain percentage of their 1RM. And certainly you can also utilize the calf raise app with both of those previous assessments that will give you the heel height, the power, and the work, both positive and negative, as well as the vertical height loss as shown there. Okay, so moving right along into our muscle and power, where we'll look at our force plates and externally fixated dynamometry. A great assessment that has been popular by Vol Performance, where you have the patient in a similar position to that of the single leg calf raise. The equipment that you're going to be needing is going to be a barbell or isometric rack. Obviously, a force plate is going to be necessary or a comparable system. I have a standardized warm-up comparable to what I utilize for individuals with ACL. So we go 3 minutes, stationary bike, 1 watt per kilogram. So if someone's 75 kilos, then they're going to be trying to put on 75 watts on the bicycle. This takes into equation, obviously, both the RPM, the revolutions per second, as well as the resistance on the bike. So obviously some of these the bikes, their resistance is arbitrary units. It's like 1, 2, 3, so on and so forth. But the watts are quantifiable and universal across different bikes, and so that's why I utilize that. You're going to want to have specific warm-ups of 3 by 3 second efforts, gradually increasing in their intensity. The tempo obviously is going to be isometric. They're going to be doing 3 to 5 max efforts per leg with 60 seconds rest in between the sets. They're going to be doing 3 to 5 repetitions of 5-second holds, 2 seconds build up, 3 seconds max effort. If you're looking for more for rapid force testing and your rate of force development, that you're going to be doing 5 by 1 second. It's going to be 10 seconds recovery, and you repeat it 2 to 3 times. The coefficient of variance with this is acceptable with less than 3 to 10% difference in the overall output from one repetition to the next and across time. The minimal detectable change in standard error of measure, however, is still yet to be determined. And as I alluded to, this is going to be a good test. It's going to have both muscle strength capacity as well as muscle power. Okay, so for the soleus biased setup, so there's been multiple setups that have been described. In the first column, you can see the force plate with the half kneeling position. Relatively a nice setup, particularly because it takes away the compensation that can occur with hip flexion going up into the dynamometer or whatever the force gauge is that you're utilizing, which can be an issue with the middle two, where you're using the more marketable setups of the force frame as well as the physiometer. Both have shown to be reliable and valid. Of note, with the half kneeling position, sometimes people can be somewhat unstable, though the image demonstrates, and what the authors have described is going arms across chest, having the individual hold lightly onto something stable can allow them to be more stable proximally and produce more accurate force output. If you're going to go with your do-it-yourself option with the handheld seated dynamometer, dynamometer, as shown there with the belt as well as the microfit handheld dynamometer. A couple of key things that you're going to want to keep in mind is that the belt really needs to be in a vertical plumb line over the metatarsal heads, and the belt tension is also going to be you're going to want to cinch that up. I'll give you further specifications as we go through this in order to ensure that the heel does not rise. So your testing recommendations is whichever one you choose, be consistent with the setup and the execution. Minimal effective padding to achieve the comfort of the test, especially if you're going to be looking at rate of force development and more rapid-based onsets. That's going to be padding can influence the results. It can also produce instability depending on the amount of padding that is being applied. But you also want the individual to be comfortable. Applying more tension to the belt or the fixated system than you otherwise want, particularly with your DYI with the handheld dynamometer. So go 90% of the way efforts or tension with the warm-up repetitions. After the individual does that, go ahead and cinch it up the final 10% to ensure that the heel does not actually lift and that you don't get any energy leaks within the setup or the system itself. And then ensure proper seated height to avoid hip flexor cramping and to achieve best results. So that's going to be right around your 90-degree marker of hip flexion as shown. Okay, so what kind of forces can we produce and expect with this? So they're actually quite high depending on the demographic that you're looking at. So they consistently fluctuate anywhere between 1.8 and 2.6 times body weight. So with the Premier League football teams, Seth O'Neill has done an incredible amount of work with this as well as with the rugby teams, and has found right around 2.0 times body weight, whereas the Everton Academy has shown up to 2.6, and then in recreational runners, it's been shown to be 1.8 to 2.0 times body weight. Really good retest reliability. Standard error of measure you can see there in newtons, which equates to about 9 to 12%, which again is in the acceptable range. If your utilization of the do-it-yourself format or setup, body weight ratio percentage has been described not quite as high as that of the force plate setup with 127 to 136% body weight depending on your gender. And then you can see the minimal detectable change of what would be considered meaningful if you're going to track this over time. And with the fixed dynamometer, ideally, again, the microfit only gives you your force output, but if you wanted to, it would be recommended to have a handheld dynamometer that gives you the force time curve as well, especially if you're going to be doing power. That's going to be a necessity. But otherwise, a good assessment for isometric force production and power. All right, so briefly reviewing the plantar flexion field tests performance. So single leg heel raise, motor coordination. You want a normalized heel height, 45% of the truncated foot length. That is the normalized peak heel height that you would expect. So the truncated foot length is defined as the distance between the first metatarsal head and the heel. So it takes out essentially the consideration of the toes, and if you're going to normalize that for what you would expect for the minimal effective heel height or expectation would be the peak heel height divided by that truncated foot and multiplied by a percentage, and it should be within close to 45% of that distance from the metatarsal to the heel. The heel height on a 10% or 10-degree slant board would be greater than 13 centimeters. Again, depending on foot length, which can potentially influence that, but on average it's 13 centimeters. Muscle endurance, the standing single leg, one-legged calf raise. So number of repetitions greater than 90% of the age and gender specific norms, which I provided within the handout and has been previously described by Hebert Lozier in 2017. The total heel height, fatigue index, and work if you're using the calf app. Proper mechanics of the ankle and of the midfoot, which is more of a qualitative assessment, as we mentioned. Muscle endurance, so midfoot biased single leg calf raise. This is where you're doing it on an incline slant board, and you just have the toes over the edge of the slant board is another way that you can bias more your midfoot assessment. Single leg muscle strength, one-legged leg press, or the seated calf raise, as I mentioned, with your predicted 1RM and normative data. Again, also both of which have been provided within the handout. And then muscle strength, the isometric calf raise, be it the isometric ankle press in standing or in seated. And then finally your muscle power standing one-legged calf raise, which would be your plantar flexion total power output. And then with your 90% limb symmetry index would be your end goal, and then 90% of demographic available norms for age as well as gender. A lot of these have been described, but some of them have yet to be determined as far as specific demographic norms. But you can consistently track internally your cohort and normative data such that you can compare the individual across the previous clients, patients, athletes that you've worked with. Moving on to the frontal plane, inversion and eversion. Once again, we'll talk about the endurance, strength, and power under the muscle performance categories. So if you're going to be looking at the muscle performance of the ankle inversion and eversion, it's important to ask the question, are there actually strength deficits here? And if so, in what patient demographics? It makes sense to look at the demographic that have a history of ankle sprains and or ongoing repeated ankle sprains and instability of the ankle, as it controls both of these muscle groups are responsible for controlling the ankle in the frontal plane. And so when you look over the current evidence, 16 relevant papers, 56% of them say yes, indeed, that there are strength deficits in these muscle groups. Mix of paper, 6% of papers say that there's a mix, so somewhat equivocal, and then 38% of them say no. But when you break it down further, you can see that the 56%, those 9 papers, that they are more relevant and more recent with a publication date on average of 2016. Their methods are higher order, 4 of the 9 having tier 1 studies, and then all the studies being published in the upper quartile of journals within this subject matter. And so the other mixed paper, the one mixed paper as well as the 6 papers that said that there was no deficit are a little bit dated, not as high quality, and occur in lower level journals. All right, sticking with the same order that we went through with the plantar flexion and dorsiflexion, so the gold standard is going to be our isokinetic testing. The setup would be having the individual in a slightly reclined position at 70 degrees, knee at 15 to 45 degrees knee flexion, the ankle at 0 to 20 degrees of plantar flexion, and then the dynamometer would be at 55 degrees of a slant. And so your range of motion is going to be anywhere between 30 and 50 degrees. Inversion being 30 to 50 degrees of arc, and then your eversion going 15 to 25. Your speeds are comparable to that of what is shown with the ankle plantar flexion and dorsiflexion of 30, 60, and 90 degrees per second. Typically, it's done, if you're looking at strength, between 5 and 10 repetitions with 3 to 7 practice repetitions. Endurance repetitions can be anywhere between 20 and 25 reps. And your rest periods are going to be 30. Your outcomes comparable to that of what we described with the isokinetic testing with the plantar flexors and dorsiflexors, normality of the strength curve and your curve profile, your peak and average torque as well as the limb symmetry index, your torque relative to body weight, your total work, and then your fatigue index and your eversion to inversion ratio would all be of relevance. And again, once again, you can look at your motor coordination or your muscle coordination, your muscle endurance, muscle strength, as well as muscle power. It's shown to be really good and excellent in its reliability, both across testers and within a tester and time test retest as well. So keeping it brief and looking at the summary here, again, this is more for your review. comparable to that, what we saw with the plantar flexors and dorsiflexors with the isokinetic testing. So you have normality in your values and for total work. Normative values, unfortunately, are unknown, but you can look at this relative from one limb to the next. And again, you can certainly build your own database of clinical experience across the demographic of the patients that you treat. When we're looking at the muscle strength, looking at concentric, inversion, and eversion, and peak torque and average peak torque, you can see the values there that it's dependent upon the type of muscle contraction, be it concentric or eccentric, as well as gender and speed specific in regards to the force outcomes that you can otherwise expect. And for the most part, the eversion to inversion ratios are going to be within 90% to 100%. For females, it may be slightly lower with a range of 60 to 100% and an average of 80. For the eccentric and concentric eversion and inversion, you can see the values are going to be the ratio of concentric to eccentric are going to be almost twice that. So you're going to be twice as strong with your eccentric than you are with your concentric. And then for your eccentric eversion to your concentric inversion, so a mixed ratio, you can expect a 3.9 to plus or minus 1.7 for the ratio, and then a 4.9 at 20 degree of inversion. So it's kind of specific to the angle at which it's being tested or that you are taking those ratios. So if you're looking more at the inversion position of 15 degrees versus 20 degrees, those would be the angles at which the mixed ratio is shown to be most differential between the healthy group and the affected group. And then muscle power, comparable to what I've endorsed previously, has been with your rate of force development. If you want to take the time interval at 100 milliseconds, the thing that I've been extrapolating from what we're seeing at the knee is looking at the rate of force development between 20 and 80% of their max volitional contraction, and then dividing that by body weight. Again, normative data here still yet to come, but tracking it over time and looking at the limb symmetry can certainly help us. Okay, so what if you don't have an isokinetic machine? What can you utilize? So the next best would be your handheld dynamometer. So you can see for handheld dynamometry, the different testing motions of the ankle. You can see once again when we're looking at our scale going from cool colors to warm colors, the warm colors being good to excellent, and really across the board, whether you look at your test retest or your inter-rater reliability, is that it's all relatively pretty good. There is that one questionable moderate or fair reliability that is shown for the right ankle, for your ankle inversion, but for the most part it would be certainly acceptable, good to excellent in the reliability. And then with this assessment and with this tool, right, so you can get muscle strength, muscle power, depending on the sampling rate of your handheld dynamometer, as well as whether it gives you a force time curve that you can utilize in order to capture force at a given time interval or within that suggested or proposed 20-80%. And then a fixated dynamometer is obviously going to be better than that of your manually fixated, even though the images here in the reliability values that you see are relative to the manually fixated. So again, a variety of setups have been described. I encourage you to find one that works for your clinical setting, be consistent, be rigorous, and with this standard operating procedure, such that any variance that you get is due to the actual fluctuation in the individual's performance rather than a comment on your setup. And you can see the all three options here are going to be with a fixated dynamometer. With the dorsiflexion, you have options of, once again, a belt stabilized, which is kind of it's manually stabilized, but it's better than using the manual force, such that you don't capture the strength of the individual doing the assessment or of the clinician. We can see the average force output that is shown for below and normalized to body weight. So for plantar flexors, 55%, dorsiflexors, 40%, at least at the neutral angles that have been that are being tested as shown. For your fixed handheld dynamometer setup, it tends to produce higher force outputs and are more accurate for individuals with greater strength, while the handheld dynamometer alone that is manually fixated may be more consistent for those with lower strength and more appropriate there, which makes sense because it's easier for the clinician to be more stable if the force output is less. And then specifically for ankle inversion and eversion, which we've been more focused on, some fixated options you can see here where they're using a pull gauge. They've neutralized the ankle, put the individual in a sideline position, used appropriate padding, but not too much. And you can see that you're going to be producing anywhere between 29 and 30% of body weight for your inversion and your eversion respectively. Okay, so for the summary of the handheld dynamometry in 1RM, so you're looking at the isometric handheld dynamometry strength assessment in this first row, regardless of the ankle motion that you're going to be testing, plantar flexion, dorsiflexion, inversion, eversion, and then a ratio. So you want to hit close to 90% of their age, gender, height, and weight predicted norms. It's going to be more robust also to monitor this relative to body weight, given it as a percentage. I provided the relative strength to body weight ratios or percentages there for each of the different assessments that I've described. For the plantar flexion and dorsiflexion, it's kind of nice that there are predictive equations that have been described using regression analyses, and all you need to do is plug in the individual's height in centimeters, age in years, and either a coding of 1 or 0 depending on male or female to be able to get their predicted handheld dynamometry 1RM force production. Muscle strength, cable column of 1RM has been described for inversion and eversion, and as well as dorsiflexion going through the range of motion. I didn't describe that here today just because I think that, yeah, I would say that there's probably more reliable means by which you can do that, and the setup can be a little bit variable, but I provided the reference there for your review if you're so interested. And then muscle power, again, you're going to need a fixated dynamometer with a force time curve and ample sampling rate of at least 100 hertz. That's taking one sample for every 100th second would be the ideal, and then you can get your rate of force development at the different time intervals as well as a different percentage percentage of max volitional contraction at 20 and 80%. Your limb comparison, no spoiler alert here, right? So it's going to be the same as previous descriptions of you want 90% limb symmetry and 90% of the expected demographic condition or surgery that the individual is recovering or recuperating from. Taking a moment to zoom out beyond just the foot and the ankle, that we also know that the hip muscles play a critical role in prevention and even in the rehabilitation of foot and ankle injuries, and there's some evidence to suggest this. So looking at hip extension strength, a decrease in hip extension muscle strength is identified as an independent risk factor for lateral ankle sprains in youth athletes, whilst an increase in muscle extension force significantly decreases the hazard of these injuries. And then looking in the frontal plane, a decrease in isometric hip abduction strength is associated with an increase in non-contact lateral ankle sprains in male soccer athletes, and has been suggested to be a predisposition for athletes with their ankle injuries. In females, asymmetries in hip abduction strength was a risk factor for non-contact ankle injuries. In more specific demographics such as chronic ankle instability, a decrease in hip flexor, abductor, and external rotation strength compared to controls. This is suggestive that the hip strength is a critical component in managing these individuals with CAI. And then you can't also forget about the importance of endurance and work capacity. And so the impact of fatigue of the hip abductors was can negatively influence ankle kinematics, muscle activity, and potentially increase the risk of ankle sprains during activities that involve single leg jumps, landing, and cuts. And then looking at the muscles around the knee, so hamstring strength and ankle instability, individuals with CAI often exhibit decreased maximal and submaximal isometric strength in the knee flexor muscles. Weakness is observed in both the injured and the non-injured limbs, suggesting more of a systemic issue rather than just a localized one. Strengthening the quadriceps and hamstring muscles as well may help to improve the overall lower limb stability, and has been suggested to be able to assist with a modifiable risk factor for ankle-related injuries. Quadriceps strength and ankle instability. So a systematic review and meta-analysis of 16 studies has demonstrated that there's a moderate decrease in concentric knee extension torque normalized to body weight, and they tested this at 60 degrees per second. And then for quadriceps strength and Achilles tendon pathology, so post-Achilles tendon rupture, there's a decrease in ankle flexor strength due to lingering deficits, and subsequent elongation of the tendon leads to an increased reliance of knee extensor muscles in order to compensate for the decreased function of the ankle, resulting in greater knee joint loads during activities such as your walking, your jogging, your running, and your cutting. And Taylor will talk about in future sections of this presentation, the relationship between the kinetic chain and the foot and the ankle. Okay, so it's obviously really beyond the context of this specific presentation to be able to give you the specific breakdown and granularity of how to be testing the proximal muscle groups. There's a whole host of other presentations that exist that can kind of help you with this, but to give you at least some guidance. So if you're going to utilize the same tools that we've described here, I selected the handheld dynamometer because I think that it is maybe more clinically relevant and available for the majority of clinicians. So regardless of your hip movement, flexion, extension, abduction, adduction, internal or external rotation, I've given you the specific positions in writing, as well as the patient position, and then the normative values relative to body weight that you can utilize in order to kind of risk stratify and determine where your athlete, your patient, your client is at. And then same for the knee. Again, whether you use an isokinetic dynamometer or a handheld dynamometer, your knee flexion angle, again, the knee is going to be flexed here to 15 or 45 degrees. Usually putting them in prone is an easy way to do it, even though the hamstring's in a relatively shortened position at the hip, and you can generate normative data based off their percent body weight, and you get a range here for males and females respectively. For extension, against the back of the plinth as shown, and then that's in a sitting position. And for males, you're looking for 86 to 115% body weight, where females slightly less than that at 80 to 95%. And then the hamstring measuring position, so whether you're at 15 or 90 degrees, for the uninjured limb strength, you're looking at 52 to 44 pounds. Again, your goal one here is going to be 90% limb symmetry index, and then 90%, or at least within one standard deviation of the demographic norms that have been suggested. Okay, in summary, for muscle performance, we spoke about the multiple different constructs: motor or muscle coordination, endurance, strength, and power. We spoke about the different metrics that we could utilize and capture for each of these different constructs. And then we spoke about, under each one, whether we're going to be talking about or measuring the foot and or at the ankle. So for your motor coordination, we spoke about the foot coordination and the modified spring ankle assessment. If you have access to an isokinetic machine, you're going to be looking for your normal force curves over the arc of motion. For your muscle endurance, we spoke about both the foot and the ankle. For your muscle strength, we spoke about, again, foot and ankle. And then for muscle power, we looked at the ankle dorsiflexion and plantar flexion, as well as the inversion and eversion. We also spoke about the fact that not all tests are created equal, and that there is a hierarchy here, with the gold standard being our isokinetic. If we can isolate or fixate our dynamometers and isolate the force and the muscle power output, that would be advantageous, especially if these have force time curves. Our force plate can be acceptable predominantly for our plantar flexion force outcomes, but is limited utility unless we get really creative with our setup for the other ankle motions and or for the foot. And then for our field testing, though these are acceptable, we know that we need to acknowledge the limitation that they have, be consistent in our setup and strategic there, such that we can reduce the variability and improve the consistency of our measurement over time. And that we're going to be, for our goals, we're going to be testing not only one limb to the next as our first means of rehab goals and decision making for clearance of activity, but then we're also going to be needing to going beyond the limb symmetry indices and holding people to a higher standard for at least 90%, at least one standard deviation, but ideally 90% of the demographic norms. And then we also spoke about don't neglect the kinetic chain, and we need to be doing this and holding people accountable at the hip and the knee muscle performance as well. In future portions of this presentation, we will be going through our muscle reactive strength. Thank you so much for listening. Please feel free to drop your comments, questions, and concerns in the chat. Happy to field those and to correspond. Thanks so much.